Hi, I'm Craig. This is part 5 of a series on Darwin's Voyage, and we're finally to the Galapagos Islands, the famous Galapagos Islands. Famous really because of Darwin, his visits to them, and the role they would eventually play. It took him a little while to realize what it was that was important about what he was seeing there. But the role the islands would eventually play in Darwin first coming to think in evolutionary terms. However, his first impression of the islands was that, quote, nothing could be less inviting. And they're not much to look at. They're mostly just extinct volcanoes. On one island, he complained that he could feel the heat from the black sand through the soles of his boots. And the first documented visit to the islands, this was several hundred years prior to Darwin. People arrived there as an accident. A group going from Peru to Panama got swept off course. And several men died there under the vertical equatorial sun, unable to find water. And the captain of the Beagle said the Galapagos was like pandemonium. Pandemonium is the capital of hell in Paradise Lost. And later, a scientifically important visitor complained that none of the travel guides had prepared him for such a, I like this term, inglorious panorama. I think that means everything kind of looks the same. And yeah, there's lava over here and lava over there and pan around, I guess, and then you look that way and there's lava too. And is what Darwin refers to as wretched little weeds, scrubby brush everywhere. My favorite criticism by Darwin is, we fancied even the bushes smelt unpleasant. Now, the general sentiment of the landscape of the islands, that seems fair. I will say there is a little variety, I think. Lava rock is kind of interesting. It can harden into undulating bumpy waves, or thick intertwining ropes erode into coarse sand, chip into sharp loose shards, crack into plates, which wobble and clang like metal when you step on them. Also kind of treacherously can harden quickly with huge room-sized gas bubbles trapped underneath. So it's like thin ice if you were to step on it and it fall below. So there's some variety. But the islands are, well, famous because of Darwin. The reason they're a prime destination for ecotourism, I mean, that's partly because of Darwin, but also because of what struck Darwin soon after as well, the animals. And the animals are so tame. So it's like a zoo you can walk through. And if you snorkel, an aquarium that you can swim through. And you can just stroll right up to the animal. You're not supposed to interact with them, but they don't run, they don't move. Often they don't even turn to look at you. Darwin walked right up to a perching hawk and pushed it off the edge of his branch with a gun. He also had no trouble catching several birds in his hat. And the famous tortoises not uncommonly grow to be over 500 pounds. And they just slowly stroll about, wherever they want to. And Darwin rode on the backs of several of them. Unfortunately, that's no longer permitted today. And he grabbed a marine iguana. These are very unusual reptiles. They dive in the water and feed on seagrass like a cow. And this thing is probably 4 feet long. And he grabs it by the tail and hurtles it into the water. And it would just run right back to him. And so he, of course, you have to do it again just to see. Yep, comes right back. I think this is still permitted. And it's all these observations together that led him in a white hot epiphany to his theory of evolution. He was just goofing around. But it does raise some questions, is like, why are the animals aren't usually like this? And the obvious answer of, well, there's hardly any predators. It's not just predators that are out, nearly everything is absent. I mean, the animals are mostly reptiles. It's the tortoise and the iguanas and birds. Of course, birds can go mostly wherever. Surprisingly, though, they actually don't. I mean, they mostly stay by land, but to the extent that they take to the air, they can get blown off course. Reptiles, they can, I think it's their metabolism. They can last for a long time without food and water. Galapagos has no amphibians, very few insects, few plants, relatively speaking, almost no mammals. And as far as the mammals that are there, it's not hard at all to think of like why bats be the exception. We'll just call them honorary birds, and sea lions honorary fish. I mean, that's stretching it a bit, but I mean, those are pretty unique as far as mammals go. And so only things that can survive the journey are things that are there, probably in most cases an unintentional journey. Historically, of course, the islands start out naked. They start out devoid of all life. They emerge from the seafloor. These are the peaks of underwater mountains. So in an archipelago like the Galapagos, it's the peaks of an underwater mountain range. And that's the same for Hawaii as well. Interestingly, Hawaii's largest island is the easternmost island. And for the Galapagos, the western islands are the largest. And that's not just a random factoid. In each case, the cause is the same. They are floating the crust on the mantle. These crustal plates are floating on the mantle and are moving in opposite directions. Hawaii's plate is moving west, Galapagos plate is moving east. And there are several hypotheses as to what the details are between the relationship of the crust and the mantle, but magma is being pushed up from a certain point. The technical name for this is hotspot. It doesn't sound very technical. It should be in Latin or something. But the plates above the hotspot move a few inches per year, and it's being pushed up where the hotspot is. So that makes not just one island, because the plate is moving, that makes, pushes up for a while, and by that time it's moved, and then it makes another island. So this is what creates the series or the archipelago. And the youngest islands are the ones right above the hotspot, and the older ones are the ones furthest from the hotspot. And over time they erode, get smaller and smaller, flatter and flatter, until they disappear back below the water. And if you looked at the Earth without any water, you'd see bigger mountains on one side. The mountains get kind of smaller and smaller and head back into the bottom of the ocean. So Darwin was most excited about the third island he visited. That's the largest island, one of the youngest, and it's made up of 5 occasionally active, not at the time, volcanoes. So he got to go right up to the crater, and these craters are just massive. And Darwin is fascinated at the time by the geology, getting to hike up to these dormant but not extinct volcanoes. So the animals, aside from their tameness, didn't have a huge impact on Darwin while he was on the island. He beautifully collected specimens, as he always would. And he did notice the mockingbirds seemed like they were different between the first 2 islands. He went to 4 islands. So he made a point of getting a mockingbird on the other 2 islands when he went to them. The finches today are what are famous. They're known as Darwin's finches, and they did have an impact on him. Mostly they're famous by being popularized in studies of them way after Darwin. For Darwin, they were a spur, but they were a spur of unclarity. He collects an inordinate number of them. He collects 23 of what later he finds are finches. He doesn't know what blackbirds, grosbeaks, wrens, warblers, they all seem kind of different. And he didn't even label them very well. He couldn't label them well in terms of identifying them, but he didn't label them well in terms of what island they came from either. That's partly why subsequent studies of them have been so interesting. He wasn't an evolutionist at the time, so. Now he would write a couple of years later in his big memoir as an explanation for why he didn't collect island by island. He says, "It never occurred to me that the productions of islands only a few miles apart and placed under the same physical conditions would be dissimilar." And then he adds, "It's the fate of every voyager when he has just discovered what object in any place is most particularly worthy of his attention to be hurried from it." So unfortunately, the Galapagos now is in his rearview mirror. It would have been something that he would be thinking over the remainder of the voyage and over the next couple of years as he comes to profound conclusions based on what he's thinking about relative to the Galapagos Islands.